And we're live. Welcome back to another episode of We Never Talk About Vulnerability, but we end up talking about vulnerability all the bloody time. It's something we never talk about, right, Stephen?
Right. That's right. It's never on our minds.
No, absolutely. And I feel for our family friends that end up listening to EPSS, prioritization, application security, and the consistent rant about all of them all. But yeah, for the few folks that don't know us and what we're talking about, I'm Francesco Cipollone. I'm the CEO and founder of Phoenix Security, and I have the absolute pleasure to have Stephen Shaffer here on the show. Stephen is a fellow passionate, shall we say, vulnerability management aficionado, shall we put it this way?
Sure. Enthusiast. Yeah. Just someone who loves this, to dive into this stuff. Yeah.
Brilliant. But for the few folks that don't know you, do you want to give a little bit of background about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So, hey, I'm Stephen. I currently work for Peloton Interactive, so the bike company, but also an app company now. Cool. And I am wrapping up my first year there. I'm a staff security automation engineer, which basically means that I try and automate a bunch of things to reduce risk within Peloton. I'm also an active special interest group member for EPSS. And then prior to my work at Peloton, I spent a majority of my career in the federal contracting space, helping a U.S. federal agency called the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid. And there I was mostly focused on cloud security architecture and engineering, some compliance, and some Appsec. So I have a pretty wide breadth of experience in a lot of different domains that all sort of wrap up nicely into vulnerabilities. And then I also have a master's of science in cybersecurity as well. So been in the industry for close to a decade now, and so loving every minute of it. So that's a little bit about myself.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And so as you had like broad exposure to the whole industry, where do you think we are right now from the whole vulnerability management space? And do we even call it vulnerability management anymore, or posture management, risk management, risk-based vulnerability management? Man, Ghana has created a lot of names for this stuff.
It's a lot of acronyms. Yeah. Gosh, where we are. We're in an interesting spot, right? Especially in the CVE space. So, I mean, for those of you who don't really follow, CVEs and how vulnerabilities get cataloged and stuff, the National Vulnerability Database and MITRE basically catalog all vulnerabilities that are reported, right? And they that has been sort of exponentially growing within the past couple of years. It's starting to take off, and there's a variety of reasons for that. One is, there's a lot more software now in the world. There's a lot more people in the world reporting these things, and there's some clout with trying to report as many as possible. Like people will take that as a sense of pride to sort of, hey, I found a CVE or whatever. So there's just a lot.
The cool kid. The cool kid if you don't have a CVE attached to your CVE.
I don't have any CVEs attached to me, so I'm like, yeah, that's not who I am. I'm like,
aside from the T-shirt.
Right. That's right. I just exploit them, right? I mean, that's my background is doing some, red team exercises and stuff like that. So fun stuff. Anyway, so it's growing. There's a large number of CVEs. I think the total is like 220K now, and it's growing by like 20K a year at this point. And I don't know what the projection is, but it's growing. Yeah. So
I think it was 35% year on this year, but I think it's even more now that we're talking about.
Yeah, it's a lot, and people are looking for them now, like with bug bounty programs and stuff like that. So there's a problem there, right? Because on the flip side of that, vulnerability management programs aren't necessarily equipped to handle the large influx of vulnerabilities being triaged by them for a variety of reasons. Their infrastructure is changing. Application structures are changing, and traditional vulnerability scanners aren't necessarily equipped to handle that. And then obviously there's the capacity problem, where you just don't have enough folks on your team to handle all of those CVEs being sometimes dumped over the fence into your plot, right? Of, hey, your application has 10 critical CVEs. Can you fix them this week, right? And that's not necessarily the most conducive way to do that, but that's some of the reality, right? That some teams are focused on. So, and then on the flip side of that, what is critical, what is high, what is medium? That's based on CVSS usually, and that's usually the base score that's provided by the National Vulnerability Database usually. And then there's also the vendor will also provide that sometimes, and those sort of dictate what is considered critical, what is considered high, and those base scores are not necessarily sending the right message. I mean, those are very much not within the scope of your environment, and they're just meant as here's no other knowledge of this vulnerability in your system. This is what the base score is, and so a lot of people will just ingest that and use that to prioritize their vulnerabilities, which is not the best case. And I think there's been articles out there that's, I think Tenable has said, like, in the past, if you just randomly remediate vulnerabilities, you might have a better shot at reducing risk than just using CVSS based scores. So it's
and that's terrifying, because it's like a score
is.
that should help you. Prioritizing is completely random.
Yeah. So I mean, that's just like CVE based stuff. We're not even talking about like non-CVE based stuff with like GitHub security advisories or things that you find internally within your own applications. Like, there's a whole element of vulnerability management that's not CVE based. And so there's also, a lot of tool sprawl over there as well, and trying to figure out the best way to prioritize things. And so there's been some emerging tech, centered around that, with things about like reachability or enrichment or there's just a lot like of people focused on
context,
on
contextualization,
metadata from your assets. And so it's I guess the state, I'd say is not good, but also not bad, right? Like there's hope, I think. So
there's change. I think if I look at it in the past 10 years, there's been a lot of scanning happening, a lot of identification of issue. Now, I think since COVID, we had critical mass hitting of everybody needed to scan, everybody going to the cloud very quickly, everybody modifying their app to be digital app, or their system to be digital system. Now, with that has come a lot of software development, but also a lot of moving quickly. And as me and you are well aware, if you move very quickly, you might break some stuff. And now we're seeing the post-capitulation of that effect. With also attacker being smarter and saying, okay, you kind of got it, and you kind of not exposing RDP system or VMware system over the internet, because we got tad bit better at identifying that with pen tests, with automated pen tests. Let's try to find another way. Oh, look, a library. I can hijack a person and an account on that library and maybe inject your credit cards into my system while you process it, and you're completely invisible. I think that's what happened with British Airways, and a library that was even embedded in the mobile app. So it was really hard to detect it from Runtime edition. And we got all of this sprawl of new attack type. And for a while, I think as an industry, we got overwhelmed, because I felt in 2020 we got lost on how do we even tackle all this sprawl of things that are new, that are being built in a fastest way that we can actually think of securing it. And then you have the sea of vulnerability on the opposite side. Like I think you mentioned 220,000 and growing, when the one that you can actually focus on, if we just take EPSS, is a fractional percentage, 4%, 9%, give or take. It's still a very lower number than that amount.
Yeah.
The challenge is right now we have teams that get kind of input from everywhere. This is the silver bullet of fixing vulnerability, and everybody's trying to sell a different silver bullet.
Yeah.
Guilty as charged, including myself.
I hate to
here's a
burst your
silver
bubble,
bullet.
but there are no silver bullets, right? And you can try as you might, but it is a process, right? It is about reducing risk. And so, yeah, I mean,
I think you mentioned the magic word, this risk.
Yes, I did.
The problem is with CVSS, I think we try to squeeze in too many things and too much complexity in something that was originally supposed to be very simple and end up being hyper complex. And that was my critique of CVSS v4, that is the new CVSS that came out, that became even more complicated, and hence it's going to take even more time to process it rather than the CVSS base core. What are your thoughts and takes on that?
Yeah, so first, CVSS scores do not equate to risk, right? We should know that. However, practice dictates otherwise, right? Like, if you have nothing else to use, CVSS is the scores are provided to you freely, right, from the National Vulnerability Database or from the vendor, and it's attractive, right, because it's already there for you, and it's like, okay, I know this is a critical severity. Let's fix these first, right? But in reality, like I said earlier, that's not necessarily the best data point to prioritize based on. I mean, you really need to try and distill what the risk is for a specific vulnerability to be exploited, right? And what is the context within that asset? Like what data is accessible from it? Can you pivot from there? There's a lot of other factors that can influence how you think about risk within the CVE world, right? And so, I think you said it's the stat is like 4% of all vulnerabilities are ever exploited, right? Or of all CVEs are ever exploited. So things like EPSS are extremely attractive to use in conjunction with CVSS to actually predict, have a probability, to prioritize based off of, right? And I think if you look at the EPSS white paper, if you use like a strategy of I think it's like 10. Anyway, if you look at the curve on it, you could have a really relatively low EPSS score to prioritize based on like 10% or something, and get a majority of the things that are actually risky.
Well, there is a debate of what is EPSS high right now. How high is high? And we had a fun share of conversation in the group of let's try to cut this data by 0.5. Let's try to cut this data by 0.6, 0.7. I think I found a sweet spot between 0.5 and 0.7, give or take. And we ended up with 42 as a joke. It's actually very true. But that in itself enabled you to reprioritize drastically the vulnerability with a very simple step. And then you can add business criticality and context. What data you have, how critical is the application, how exposed is the application. That's one part of the prioritization. The other side is the boring stuff of even identifying who needs to do what, where, and doing that programmatically and systematically.
Yeah.
Because everybody that is trying to sell the silver bullet doesn't realize that those are process driven. So we should sell silver bullet to accelerate process rather than silver bullet to resolve a solution.
Yeah,
no, that's my take on the silver bullet.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, no technology out of the box is going to help you. Like it's going to give you a framework to work with it, right? So, things, software that like includes, hey, if you give us, the asset criticality of this specific asset, will change your risk score or your prioritization based on that. Well, the problem there is that asset management is really hard, and on top of that, you're asking teams to say, well, how to keep a track of what those critical assets actually are, let alone maybe sometimes on a scale, right? And then you can go down a rabbit hole of like, okay, what does that mean? What does this mean? What does this mean? And it's really important to at least start somewhere and just like iterate, right? And move forward instead of getting like analysis paralysis where like, you can think about all these different things that can impact your risk profile, right? And you can come up with solutions for all of them, right? But you have to start somewhere. And what I tell people a lot is, if you have like use EPSS, that's a great place to start. Use threat intel, which is another thing we can talk about to start there. But it sort of cascades that way. As long as you continue down the path of enriching your findings and enriching your assets with context, the more you do that, the better view or picture you're going to get of your risk profile, really. And a lot of people, you just have to start, right? And a lot of people just don't have the capacity to even do that. So it's a difficult challenge.
I agree, and I think so. Hey Patrick, hey other LinkedIn user, but Seth actually has raised a point that is quite interesting.
Yeah,
that is regulation. That is, unfortunately, a lot of regulation is fixated on CVSS. And I had my fair share of laugh on seeing organizations thinking, well, we're thinking in a very smart way, but we report in a very dumb way outside.
Yeah. Regulation's
what do you think
interesting,
about
right?
regulation?
Because it's I think to some harking back to some of the conversations that we've had, in the SIG or even publicly on LinkedIn, CVSS it's an industry standard, right? And it's so ingrained in how people do things within vulnerability management, but it's not scaling, right? It wasn't, I don't know if, like, I don't know the inner workings of that group, right? But, when you look at it, I think the weighted average or something of a CVSS score is like in the 7s or something like that, which means like most of them are high. And I think on the flip side of that, with PCI, I know, if something's externally facing, and it's a CVSS score of 4, you need to fix it or else you'll fail.
Yeah.
And I think if you look at the data, that's like something like 90+% of all CVSS scored vulnerabilities are 4 and above, which is just utterly ridiculous. And when you think about it, it's like, okay, well, if everything's critical, nothing is, right? Or if everything's high, nothing is.
I think there is a bias from a CVSS perspective. I think the problem is CVSS was originally created to identify the high and critical. So that's why there is, I think, a percentage bias. And I think I have, let me see if I can share the screen. I think I have the numbers here. I think it's 55% of all, around 50+% of vulnerability are actually on this side. And then if you take the medium that is CVSS 4, it's almost everything.
Yeah, it's like 97% error. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. It's ridiculous. But that's just base scores, right? And the idea is to obviously augment them, but that's also work that folks don't want to do, and it's
Another couple of things that I like as well, and this is very simple on just CVSS, is looking at fundamentally at code execution, remote code execution, or denial of service. That is the prevalence of CVSS, but those are the dangerous one. So that can be another cut of those vulnerability or the consequence, like SQL injection or cross-site scripting, that are dangerous as well. So this is some other element that you can cut the data. But if you just comply to a standard and regulation, I think just limit the scope as much as you can. Like with PCI DSS, you can just say, these 5 servers are actually the one that process the card data, or this environment is the one that processes the card data. For this, we'll fix everything, but for others, we'll do a bit more of an intelligent work.
Yeah. I mean, each organization's context is different, right? And so it's incredibly important to have, mature asset metadata to say, what is that PCI scope? What are the systems that are processing that card data? What are the systems that are processing other sensitive data, so that you can actually use that in your prioritization scheme to scale that, right? Like that's the benefit of doing that, is being able to scale your vulnerability management program to with the ability to ingest more data. Just fix all the ones.
Patrick is being facetious. Fix all the bull. Well, there is a trend that is saying stop the bleed, and there is a whole trend of like, okay, fix all the old vuln, but then fix and stop the bleed. I think the challenge is in software development as well. That might impact on solving a lot of non-existing vulnerabilities. So that needs to be coupled up with risk management, with exception management, with looking at what is actually fixable. Or you might not want to fix all those vulns. You might just want to fix a library in a different, more intelligent way. I think stopping the bleed and gating process, for me, particularly in my past life as a engineer, has given me more frustration and headache than anything else. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I sort of look at it this way, right? Like when a lot of folks are in this predicament, right, where vulnerabilities are just overwhelming them. They don't really know what to do. But also on the flip side, the more mature organizations are using, things like paved road, where they have these processes in place to sort of allow developers to just develop and not have to worry about, fixing vulnerabilities. Like there are processes and methods to sort of offload that from the folks who are actually moving a business forward, right, or producing products for the business in a risk-averse way. And so it's twofold, right? It's how do we stop the bleeding? It's doing, stopping things and doing prioritization for what's actually important and figuring that out, right? Like stop spending cycles on prioritization based on like just CVSS, and start incorporating public data such as EPSS or threat intelligence that's open to the public, like the Kev or something like that, to actually prioritize what's being exploited upon. And then you can actually show that you're moving forward in a risk-based fashion, right? And you should feel a lot more comfortable looking at those data points that are enriched, because they will reduce the numbers of vulnerabilities that you actually have to fix, right?
Yeah, you move from 200.
Yeah,
I think you moved to 240,000. Into, I mean, if you just take EPSS or EPSS, what we consider high, you're just talking about 600 vulnerability versus the 204,000. So it's like a fraction of a percentage.
I'm not going to agree with that threshold, but that's fine.
Nobody is. Nobody is.
And then on the flip side, right, like is once you have some of that data, right, you can actually start patching, like, or not patching as in like patching your assets, but like patching your process, right? How do you start, fixing the root cause of some of the either the vulnerabilities that are being introduced into your environment, say like vulnerable libraries that you're not keeping up, with its updates or something like that they're pinned versions somewhere, right? And how do you sort of like it, find those problems in your data set and communicate those problems to the people that are most affected by it, and also to leadership to say, hey, we did the data analysis where we understand that this is the root cause of this problem that is generating risk for us, right? And then how do we sort of spend and prioritize engineering cycles to fix that problem?
You need to evidence that, like from a business perspective. I'm spending cycle on fixing vulnerability because my PCI DSS auditor said that I'm not gonna be able to process any card data if I don't fix that. That's a good business reason to actually go and fix problem. But then on the other side is, okay, do I fix them all or do I do that intelligently? And there seems to be a pushback on doing things intelligently because you need to evidence that those intelligence are actually better than doing things randomly. That for me was crazy, but it's an interesting fact.
Yeah, especially like in the PCI space. I know you're obviously going to vary auditor to auditor, right? But if you can, show that you're, acting in the best interest of protecting that payment card data, with enriching with things like EPSS or any other asset context, to not fix something that's CVSS based for. I mean, they'll probably work with you, right? Like they're human too, and they understand risk just as much as you do, right? The flip side of that is obviously you can use those other sources to enrich the CVSS score as well. And if you want to play within those confines of CVSS, like CVSS 3 has the temporal and the environmental, right? And then the new one V4 has threat and environmental. I think it's but there's, even with just looking at exploit data and the data that's available to you, and saying like, hey, there's no intelligence within my feeds that are telling me, so like exploit code maturity or exploit maturity for threat in version 4. That's like a huge opportunity for you to take threat intelligence about or vulnerability intelligence to enrich your scoring, to potentially lower the score, but also reprioritize if you want to stay within the confines of this system. So that's another option.
This was just Patrick putting together the difference between the V3 and V4 that I found really useful. I'm sorry, Patrick, I butchered your name, your surname on this slide. But yeah, there's been a lot more complexity introduced by V4 in here. And I think using a more risk-based approach, as you were saying, instead of CVSS, works a little bit better because business understand risk. Now, a lot of CISO has still their dashboard based on CVE and CVSS. So what's critical is critical. You can turn those things around saying, okay, this is critical risk that encompass all the likelihood of exploitations like EPSS or CISA Kev or other material like business impact assessment, how critical data you are processing, how important is your application, and things like that. That forms logically risk. Now, how do we go from pure vulnerabilities on the CV base in the whole other world that is product security, application security, and so on?
That's a really good question. I mean, there's emerging tech out there, such as reachability analysis, which is super powerful, right? Like if you're able to deduce what the, say like you get a detection for, well, really that's OSS. So, I mean, my focus really isn't much in AppSec anymore, so I can't really speak really well to that. But I would imagine that it's a lot harder, right? Like you're not able to really use some of the publicly available data around CVEs and correlate it with that, right? I'm curious to hear what you have to say about that, Frank. Yeah.
Well, AppSec is hard. First of all,
Yeah.
let's start with that.
Yeah.
Let's start with
hard.
this piece.
Harder.
I think, well, operational security, these aspects that I tend to see, or environment context or environmental aspects, tend to be kind of binary where you're running your AppSec, where you're running your tool. You have a vulnerability, you don't have a vulnerability. The stage where a piece of code goes through is different, and the way to test and identify vulnerability to narrow it down is different. Like the stuff that a SAS scanner will find is not the same from an SCA scanner will find.
Yeah, I mean, you're
it will narrow down.
Yeah, you're mostly dependent on your own, context in this area, right? And understanding, the business criticality of this application, the which environment it's in. Some of that context is especially useful when you're prioritizing things, right? Then there's also the other thing, you have scanning technology, at various stages in that process, right? So you're getting data from all of those different scanners, and it's when you're trying to make sense of that, can be kind of hard, especially in larger organizations that have a lot of dispersed teams that are working on things that are completely different from each other. It can be hard to sort of make sense of all that. And I know doing that within the context of things that are not CVEs can be even trickier. So like, obviously there are tools to sort of stop developers from, committing vulnerable code and stuff like that. But things that, get discovered after the fact is really where that prioritization comes into play.
But I think I agree with you, but I've seen a nice, interesting things that is, sorry for the bit marketing, but this is what application security or ASPM was created with Ghana, and then now is evolving in product security. That is basically what you build and where you build it, regardless that is in cloud or in infrastructure, if you're running in your traditional world or in your cloud world. And I like it because it kind of encompasses your discovery and asset management, your scanning and enrichment, your whole prioritization piece, and then the action piece that encompass the whole flow of modern vulnerability management. I like to see that this is going more towards the direction. And then the tools and methods and the way you gate and stop or the process are really into this space on how do you stop the bleed or how do you fix specific things. Like from a code perspective, you might fix when you build the code or when you ingest a library or when you build an API. Those happen at different stages. But from an organization, really looking at an application and what it means and where it is deployed, and all these contexts coming together, and who needs to fix what at which stage, then comes after. And which tool do you use where?
Yeah. I mean, and then certain tools are like purpose built for, certain languages or certain types of capabilities, right? So you really have to, like, tool sprawl is definitely like an issue. And having like a dedicated team to sort of configure those things to sort of get better insights into your, go ahead, Frank.
I'm curious to ask you, like, do you think best of, like, a lot of tools right now, a lot of organizations saying, I do everything from code to cloud, I'll scan, identify, fix, prioritize, and clean your toilet and change the nappy of your baby.
I mean, it goes back like that whole thing, right? It goes back to, I guess the size. Like, I'm not gonna name names, right? But certain organizations that support or produce certain security tools, right? Some of them are small and they're purpose built for specific things, and they're really good at those things. And then there's other ones who have been in the industry for a long time, who they're a victim of capitalism, right? They have to continuously grow and provide new capabilities and expand uh, their footprint, and a consequence of that is sometimes they just don't do things particularly well, right? And you sort of have to weigh that when you're someone in my shoes, right, who has to look at um, the field of products or tools that you're looking at, whether it's someone that's supported from an organization or a company that's selling the tool, or something that's open source, is uh, you know what fidelity of data am I going to get out of this? And that's not necessarily the easiest thing to sort of evaluate, but you can sort of deduce that through age of the company, asking pertinent questions during evaluation, and um, you know testing it yourself, right? Like what are you getting out of it? So yeah.
The challenge, though, is that you get locked in. Like if you buy
uh,
into a vendor and then add a piece, like it's luring because it's like, okay, just enable a module, and then you get locked in and you can't take that data out. So that's why I was a big fan of the whole risk-based vulnerability management, now evolved as a tool and technology and application security posture management, because you have the freedom of the data. You're actually in control of your data, and you decide, I'm
yeah,
going to
it's
unplug this
huge.
tool, I'm going to scan with these other things. And then maybe if you're an organization that have grown with merger and acquisition, you might have 6 divisions that have 6 different tooling and technology, and good luck in trying to convince them of using one single tool, even from
Yeah,
one function.
yeah, a lot of what I see, a lot of like immature organizations will focus on the tech, right? Like, hey, what's the tech that'll enable us? But it really the other way is around. It's or not, or they'll focus on the tech to sort of give them capabilities, and just be like, okay, we're going to use this tech for X capability. And the way that I look at it, right, is it's a people and process problem, right? Like, let's look at what capabilities do we want, right? And in the confines of vulnerability management, we want to be able to deduce risk in the best possible way, right? And so, like, what are the tools that are going to give us that insight into our stack, right? um, and then we're getting the right people to obviously operate those things and action them.
But it makes me laugh. It makes me laugh when people just say, just fix it, because this is what I use. So I should say, okay, identify a problem from here to actually
Yeah,
go and actually fix it. And there is like 400 steps, 400 people. Is it action alerts? Do I need to react on it? Do I risk accept it? Do I defer? Do I add it in the backlog? Do I triage? Do I change the priority? Like there is a whole process behind it that people says, yes, you identify the issue. This is actually the bulk of the problem. This is why it takes so long to actually get that. And having tool like vulnerability management or posture management that accelerate this process, I think is particularly key, because this is where a lot of organization and people get bogged down and burn out, to be frankly honest, where I came from originally.
yeah. I mean, and that goes back to what I said earlier, right? With how CVEs are just exponentially growing, right? Like, that process isn't like, if that's a homegrown process that doesn't have tool support, or tooling to help automate some of those things, you're gonna drown, right? Like,
It's 100%. You're
yeah,
going to burn out and drown.
yeah. And it's basically just it's gonna be broken, right? Like, it's like, okay, I can't keep up anymore. The backlog's filling up. Like, you're literally in that boat trying to get water out, right? And you're sinking at the same time. Um,
The challenge is not a lot of organizations were born and will never be born with scanning at the very beginning. Like as soon as you turn on a scanner, you get millions of vulnerability, like 200,000 per day at least, if you're processing at scale.
Yeah.
And that's not even a crazy number. And
No, it's not.
no human
Like,
ever will be able to deal with that.
Yeah, I laugh because I can resonate with that. So,
and then you have the cloud, because in the cloud you have also assets that are ephemeral. Like if you scan everything in the cloud, you get things that pops up, pops down. The asset management becomes even more critical in those kind of environment, because
and
writing exception at scale, for example.
I want to touch on that because a lot of traditional network-based vulnerability scanners. So thinking like Tenable, Qualys, Rapid7, right? They're not like this could be changed by now, but I don't know. But my experience has been they're not really capable of knowing that, right? Like it's just they pop up and down. So here's like 10 findings from that instance, and guess what? It comes up the next day, it's 10 more. Comes up next day, it's 10 more. And it's not smart enough to know that this is really
this is dead.
It's yes, this is dead. Like, so the vulnerabilities should be closed, right? Like they're not real, but it also goes back to the fact, like, okay, wait, well, can I correlate this with an AMI, right? Like for with an AWS, right? Is it the machine image that is the problem? Most of the time it's yes, right? But like those tools aren't capable of making that correlation, and so you basically have to offload that into say like you put it into like a data lake or into Splunk, and you have to like correlate that yourself to do that.
Good luck with data quality.
And yeah, it can get really hairy really quickly. And so there are newer tools coming out now that do have that knowledge and have that capability to say like, oh yeah, like these instances are dead, or it's part of an auto scaling group, right? Like we'll close them, but I haven't really seen a way to sort of like say, hey, we noticed this is going up and down, like the AMI is causing it's generating a lot of findings, right? You should probably fix the AMI. Fix the AMI.
Well, it's the same issue that you had with the container, right? You have a lot of containers sprawl, and then you have the image. So do you scan the image or do you scan the runtime? Most of the time, scanning the images will get your south problem fixed. But the problem is if you start from a pure vulnerability management perspective, I scan everything. I want to know the posture of everything. And then you need to deal with ephemeral assets and how those things scale up and down, and how do you deal with those kind of size problem. And writing exceptional scale based on skill set or resource group in a proper vulnerability management tooling will take all of these things away. Like saying if it belongs to a resource group or if it belongs to a skill set. The challenge is, as a scanning tool, you're good at identifying issue. You're not good at identifying context. And then there is a bunch of other series of tools that are good at identifying context that are absolutely terrible at identifying issue. If you try to bring the two work together, you will necessarily have a compromise of some sort. And usually the compromise is finding problems and not knowing where they are, and are just very good at identifying problems. Also because those products are benchmarked on how much stuff they can find, not how quiet they can be.
Yeah.
Like, tell me if you saw a security tool that says, I find 0 vulnerability. I'm really good for you.
Yeah.
Tell me ever, in any marketing ever, where you've seen that happen.
That's right. You bring up a good point. Like, it goes back to what I was saying, how, if you have a lot of capabilities within your product suite, like there's going to be some quality issues somewhere, right? So it's important just to, when you're selecting tooling like that, especially when you're like cloud context and vulnerabilities, most of the time you're going to have to pipe them together to get that correlation, right? And outside of tooling, right? Usually that's in something like a SIM or a data lake, where you're doing that at scale on a daily basis, right? Because it's usually those things are short-lived, so you're constantly having to do that, which again exacerbates the problem of constantly trying to measure your risk based on change, like your infrastructure changing, on a daily, sometimes hourly basis, right? And so,
But that's where engineering comes really in place,
yeah,
because like a tool like a data lake or a vulnerability management or from an application security perspective, a posture management tool can give you the firepower to actually write those rules at scale and those context rules at scale. But the intelligence to say these are my skill group, skill set, this is what I want to ignore. That is up to you. But if we keep on building those tools or trying to build these things in house, and I'm guilty as charged because we tried to build it originally in-house, something like this. And it
it's
becomes so
hard.
complex because
Yeah,
you need to correlate so much data, and then the
yeah,
API change all the time. So the data structure change all the time. So you end up spending doing data cleansing and data modeling and data engineering work and security work. And then you still need to fix those things.
which I'm glad you're talking about this because it actually wraps really well back around to EPSS, right? Because that is, EPSS is a machine learning model that does do these correlations for exploitability or exploits activity for CVEs, right? And it basically is offloading some of that correlation work for you and prioritization work for you through this model. And so you don't necessarily have to like build a lot of context if you're using it correctly, right? And that's, I think, one of the biggest values of using something like EPSS is that you're essentially offloading some of that correlation that you don't necessarily have to do in
So
house.
let's talk.
Yeah,
Let's talk a
yeah,
little bit about EPSS and what it is actually, because we
yeah,
keep on mentioning it, but we
yeah, yeah,
actually
yeah.
never explain what it is. And I'm guilty
We
as
just
charged. Like I do that all the time.
yeah. You want to explain it or you want me to?
Yeah, no, I'll go for it. So it's expert prediction scoring. So it's a machine learning model that look at fundamentally a bunch of HoneyNet data that um, fundamentally see with a delay of 15 to 30 days roughly on how much something can get exploited in prediction in next 30 days, looking at a number of factors, but the majority is HoneyNet sensors. They look at the likelihood of exploitation of specific CV-based attack based on sensor. So if you can develop the sensor, you can see it. Hence why it's a little bit worse on things that are software specific. And then it looks at number of reference link and few other element around to kind of predict how much a vulnerability will get exploited. Now, caveat to that is if you have a CTI, usually that's much more fast and precise at the very beginning. Afterwards, it might change or it might get comparable. But in the first 15 to 45 days, I think CTI perform much better than EPSS on targeted attack, especially, or sector specific attack. And then EPSS becomes really useful on the old vulnerability to look at scale who is targeting what, or who is attacking what in the web.
Yeah,
Hence
I mean,
why you get all that correlation data outside. You get other things like if there is an exploit available, if there is a fix available that you can use as well in non-CVE related specific stuff. But that's a whole different subject around application security and reachability and other things. But it's a very useful tool to actually, if you don't have anything, that enables you to kind of cut down almost to 4%, 10%, decide how much you want, but it's still a fraction of the original CVSS that you need to be pay attention of.
yeah, I mean, definitely using it just out of the box by itself, and using a threshold like something like 10% or even just like 5%. A majority of EPSS scores, I don't know what the exact number is, but it's under 1% or something like that. It's very low, right? Or a majority of them are very low. And so if you just focus on like the ones that are, you know, 5% or above or 10% or above, like you're fixing it, you're getting like it's the whole
97% below
yeah
0.5.
exactly, there you go. You're getting, it's the whole, you're getting 80% of the way there with 20% of the effort, right? Like it is impactful just to use that. So but with the caveat, like you said earlier, with what is the data actually built on, right? Or what is the model actually built on, like the IDS data from honeypots or network devices from data partners, right? So there's caveats to using it, right? But it's still incredibly valuable, and it shouldn't be discarded because there are caveats. There's caveats with literally every tool out there, right? Especially with scoring systems like CVSS or other things like SSVC, right? There's caveats. There's always going to be caveats, and you need to use the tool, something like EPSS, in places where it is purpose
Logical.
Yeah, logical, right? Like don't just like when like you just said with CTI, commercial threat intelligence, if you have threat intelligence that's telling you something is actively exploited, obviously act on that.
Yeah.
don't rely on EPSS for that, right? Like there's a hierarchy there. If you're getting solid intelligence indicators that a certain CVE is being actively exploited in the wild right now, or it's been observed in the past like week or so, that's a pretty high fidelity signal that you should be focused on to prioritize your CVEs. So
exactly. So if somebody is targeting you, if something is targeting your particular sector, that particular CV at a high scale, that should be a higher signal. But in absence of everything, EPSS could be at the beginning of the scores. In absence of even EPSS, you can use SSVC to actually look at what is exploitable, what is impactful, if a particular vulnerability has an exploit available. And you can reuse some of this logic as well in SSVC to say, okay, like I like to use this parameter to say what is the popularity of an exploit in the world. This is being used by 0 day. Is it automatable at scale? And then that's where the broad threat intelligence like EPSS come in place, or the targeted CTI come into place. And other factor like if it's actively exploited, it is confirmed, it is used. Like the quality and the definition and the refinement of those signals become more and more precise as you use it fundamentally.
Yeah,
and there it
100%.
goes in full circle. Why the heck regulation hasn't catch up with all this?
Well, regulation is notoriously slow, and things like there. If you look at like the BOD, or the binding operational directive that created the Kev, the known exploited vulnerability catalog that's maintained by CISA, which is just a catalog of CVEs that based on CISA's
exploitability and fixability.
Yeah, they have that. But I think if you look at the bot itself, I think in there they actually say this. I think, and I want to. I don't have the quote, but like it's you should be prioritizing things based on exploit activity, right? It says that in the bot, and part of that, and part of the outcome of the bot is obviously the Kev catalog, right? But they're not take that, right? That is guidance from CISA saying use that as your prioritization, or use that as part of your prioritization scheme. And so I'm not sure, I think a lot of, at least for like the federal agencies, they have to fix the Kevs in X amount of days, right? But on top of that, folks, both private and public side should be exploring threat intelligence to integrate into your vulnerability management program. A lot of tools actually have exploit maturity and stuff like in them. I know Sneak does. I know like
exploit maturity in itself, though, it's part of it, right? If something is exploited, it's a signal. But if somebody is exploited and use or is popular, and somebody's using it from a bug bounty on a threat modeling perspective, or like EPSS, if you strip it to the core, it tells you this particular CV is being used in the wild right now, and we know that is exploitable. So cross-reference, for example, if there is a POC in GitHub and EPSS, it gives you a very good signal of, yes, this is actually being used. You should focus on this. And this particular vulnerability is fixable. Like, even if you take that basic logic.
Like, if there's a public exploit available, or even POC, right? Like, prioritize that as well. Like, there are a lot of signals that influence EPSS, so that can be, I don't want to take away from like the nuances of EPSS score, but taking things out and putting them into the exploitability like context, threat intelligence and what public exploits are out there, like those are likely to lead to exploits happening, observed exploit behavior. So
I mean, having an exploit and not, I think you have 9,000 right now, you're pushing to 10,000 exploit available. GitHub Exploit DB has something like that. There are actually 17,000 bug bounty exploited CV. So the number, I like this number better because it gives you a bit of more intelligence around how many vulnerabilities actually being used at scale by bug bounty program and reported, rather than you might have. But if you narrow it down of active exploit that is basically using EPSS and saying, or bug bounty program or verified exploit, is a fraction of the original 9,000. It's actually a very, very smaller fraction, because unfortunately GitHub is cluttered of information. Now, GitHub ID that is becoming better than EPSS, that is becoming better than MVD at some stage, is an interesting initiative. But also there are, I've seen in the last days, a sprawl of NVD-like, of non-CVE related databases with vulnerability. So I'm afraid we're going to go back to the total vulnerability as a sprawl and growth, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Because everybody wants to have a CV or want to record a CV.
Yeah. I mean, it just, the root of the problem is just the massive amount of data, right? Like the massive amount of data that we're getting from our tooling and the signals that we're getting, right? I mean, obviously, like software development and securing, secure by default is a huge thing that can reduce that. But regardless of the status of that, right? The people on within the practitioner space of trying to make sense of all this have a large problem on their hands, right? And so it goes to show you, I think like one of the main takeaways I want to get in here is like there are frameworks out there such as actually enriching CVSS. It's not perfect, right? But there are methods out there that can be used to automatically change, a CVSS score based on threat intelligence or something like that, or your asset metadata. Flip side, EPSS can drastically lower your landscape of CVEs that you are worried about based on risk, because there's basically a probability that that these are going to be exploited, so you should focus on those. And then on the flip side, like if you want to sort of go down the road to even sort of codifying your own risk profile, something like SSVC is like super powerful in order to do that, because you're telling people, hey, we care about these things, and this is what is influencing our risk.
And you've wrote plenty of things around this as well. So I wanted to also leave, if you can leave your blog in a comment that this is documented, so people can go and see all of your article on SSVC, on EPSS, and a few other things that I really enjoy reading and debating, because I'm a massive nerd on this stuff, unfortunately, as well as you are. And data visualization with Patrick. I think I've seen, if I want to wrap up, I think I've seen a positive move, and especially in the last 2 years, there's been a massive move in a positive direction from a regulation perspective to actually improve the prioritization. Now we need to focus on the other aspect of the process, that is automating the process and procedure of vulnerability management and inserting vulnerability management into regulation to actually make sure that organizations do vulnerability management, not just scanning, because scanning is not fixing stuff. Scanning is not getting things over the line. But it's a positive message. Like, I want to leave folks with the fact that there are more people looking at it, excited like you, Stephen, on discussing and debating about it. And there's been a massive move towards a more mature space from a pure exploitability into looking at the problem holistically. And just in the last 2 years, we've seen an enormous amount of improvement, driven by regulation. Like the board has pushed the boundaries a lot, and I think that should be the role of regulation, of like trying to get us beyond and above and beyond the line of where we are on the status quo, and trying to push us to do something, leave us the way to do it at hand. Hopefully not all the vendor will say, I will fix this problem with a silver bullet. But
yeah,
what are your closing thoughts aside from, we're getting better?
yeah. I mean, my closing. If you're going to do one thing, right, to take away from this, well, really two things, right? Use EPSS, right? It's useful. It is useful. If you have questions about its applicability, or you're concerned with its opaqueness because you don't understand the underlying data that's being used, or if you have questions about thresholds or stuff, I encourage you to come apply to join the SIG, because we do talk about those things. And we have a Slack channel, so like we're all sort of available there. So we this is like something that we talk about a lot, right? Because people in the SIG don't have access to the underlying data either, right? And so, but we do ask questions about how the model is being used and stuff like that. So it's fascinating because you're learning about machine learning at the same time, like myself. So definitely like look into EPSS, right? And then on the flip side of that, use threat intelligence that's available to you, even if it's free, just like the Kev, right? Like there's like the indicators of exploitation that are things that are being actively exploited should be your first line of, your first stage of prioritization. Okay, what's being exploited, right? EPSS to augment that. Those are my two closing thoughts. So
brilliant. And from my perspective, as I said, it's like focusing on the process, focusing on looking at what is a product, and focusing more on product security instead of just fighting between, this is an application, this is something else, because it's easier to actually discuss with the business in terms of risk, in terms of product perspective, and helps bringing into application security a lot of this intelligence information, because those CVE based and vulnerability based and threat intelligence are usually based on the context where you're running your application, your IP address, your threat intelligence. So if you bring with application security posture management, these two work together of your cloud infrastructure and so on into one single space, you can actually leverage different set of data set and information that usually wouldn't be available to you, and prioritize or correlating or having the idea compensating control, for example, that you might have in a cloud environment, or how exposed is an application that you normally wouldn't take. So let's go. It's 2023, almost 2024. Let's go beyond application security and vulnerability management and start calling it product security.
Yeah, it's complex.
Brilliant.
But you have folks like us who are trying to solve this problem and want to talk about it. So we're here. Talk to us.
It looks like a therapy group. Anyway, everybody, thank you so much for coming. Stephen, thank you so much for nerding and
Yeah, absolutely.
and ranting with me on this. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show. Thank you so much.
Likewise. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.